I think my mother did exactly the right thing. I think it's absolutely extraordinary.
It was not a warning. It was not a temporary suspension. And it was not another carefully worded palace compromise. King Charles had made the order final. Anne's Princess Royal title was to be officially removed from official royal documents. For the woman who had spent decades carrying duty like armor, the decision landed with almost unimaginable force. But inside the palace, one detail disturbed senior figures even more. Charles had signed the order himself, and Anne had not been told first. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Windsor woke to an order that demanded immediate action. Senior royal offices received the king's direct instruction before ordinary morning briefings had ended. The Princess Royal title, the special royal designation traditionally given to the sovereign's eldest daughter, was to disappear from future official records and ceremonial paperwork referring to Anne. This mattered because those documents did more than list names. They defined status, duty, and how decades of service were formally recognized by the monarchy. Anne was reviewing engagements when an aide placed the notice before her. She read the first page, stopped, and slowly set her glasses beside the folder. "Did my brother sign this?" she asked. The aide hesitated before confirming it. She said nothing more. The silence carried fury, but beneath it was something worse. The pain of learning Charles had acted without giving his sister one private conversation. Charles sat alone after approving the file, untouched tea cooling beside him. The king understood exactly what he had done. He had not merely changed rank on paper. He had struck at the identity Anne had carried through years of relentless duty. Yet the monarch did not withdraw the instruction. Whatever had passed between them had hardened into something stronger than regret. Two senior courtiers then found the phrase that changed everything. A private note attached to the order cited a breakdown of confidence, meaning the king no longer believed the working relationship could continue as before. Both officials immediately understood this was no routine administrative change. A hidden confrontation had happened. William saw another warning. The prince discovered the order had bypassed the usual family consultation route, the private process allowing senior relatives to discuss deeply personal royal decisions before they become active. He requested the complete file and found a date written in the margin. Anne closed her engagement folder, dismissed everyone, and remained alone. She refused to cry. But 3 weeks earlier, at one royal ceremony, she had spoken words Charles had apparently never forgotten. Because the title had been erased in a single morning, but the wound behind Charles's decision had been growing between brother and sister for far longer. To understand why the king's order cut so deeply, one truth had to be remembered. Anne had never treated her title as decoration. She had worn duty through exhaustion, scandal, family fracture, and national mourning. Charles knew that better than anyone. He had watched his sister become the royal who rarely complained and almost never stepped back. That was why his decision felt so personal. He had not simply altered a document. He had struck at the language of her life's work. Anne had built her place in the family through discipline, not demands. The Princess Royal title, the special designation traditionally given by a sovereign to his eldest daughter, carried deep meaning because she had tied it to years of relentless service. She rarely asked for praise. She simply arrived, worked, and kept moving when family scandals or private grief threatened to overwhelm everyone around her. Charles had once valued that strength more than almost anyone. Charles remembered the moments when polished palace advice had failed him. The king would turn to his sister because she spoke plainly, even when the truth was uncomfortable. After their mother's death, he had thanked Anne during a private conversation for remaining close. He admitted the weight of duty felt almost impossible, and told her that her honesty had helped him stand through it. She had never forgotten those words. Now they returned like a wound. Anne stood beside a desk covered with engagement papers when William visited privately. The prince watched her straighten one page after another. She calmly told him every scheduled duty would continue. Nothing would be cancelled. But when he mentioned Charles, her voice tightened. William asked whether she had received a warning before the order. She looked directly at him and answered no. William felt the meaning immediately. Anne had been given no family meeting, no private conversation, and no opportunity to answer the accusation of a breakdown of confidence. A phrase meaning trust between senior royal figures had supposedly collapsed. The future king understood why she felt betrayed. Charles had once admired her independence. Now the monarch seemed to treat the same quality as defiance. Camilla later approached Charles alone and quietly asked whether removing the title had been truly necessary. The queen consort barely finished the question before he cut her off. He refused to discuss Anne and ended the conversation with unusual sharpness. She left convinced that this was no ordinary dispute. Anne finally turned back to William. She told him there was one moment her brother would never forgive, one ceremony, one challenge, and several people whose loyalty mattered deeply to Charles had heard every word. And once Anne named that ceremony, William understood that the royal fracture had begun with one sentence, spoken at exactly the wrong moment. 3 weeks before the order, no one believed they were witnessing the beginning of a royal rupture. The gathering had been formal, controlled, and designed to display unity. Charles arrived expecting obedience to a new ceremonial arrangement. Anne arrived expecting duty to remain untouched by personal preference. Then, during a private briefing before the event, the king gave an instruction his sister considered impossible to accept. Anne answered him in front of William and 2 senior household officials, and the room changed instantly. Charles had called the Windsor service briefing to settle the order for a major royal ceremony. The briefing was a private meeting where senior family members were told where they would stand, move, and appear during duties. Without hesitation, the king introduced a revised arrangement, placing Anne outside her traditional senior family position. He explained that the monarchy had to show a clearer line around the sovereign and direct succession. To his sister, it felt like decades of service were being pushed aside. Anne listened until Charles finished. Then she spoke without softening a single word. "You are confusing loyalty with silence." The sentence landed hard. William looked toward his father, while the 2 household officials lowered their eyes. The prince understood the danger. His aunt had challenged the monarch in a room where obedience carried enormous weight. Charles froze. The king did not hear honesty in Anne's words. He heard defiance. Worse, he knew others had heard it too. The monarch placed his briefing card on the table and ordered everyone except his sister to leave. William hesitated at the door. Charles repeated the command, sharper this time, and the future king finally stepped out. Anne refused to retreat. She told her brother that removing experienced voices would leave him surrounded by people who confirmed every decision. Charles listened, but his anger only deepened. The very bluntness he once trusted now felt like an attack on his reign. She believed she was protecting him. He believed she was undermining him. Charles finally answered in a low voice. "Then perhaps your position must be reconsidered." Anne thought the words came from anger and would die with the argument. But the documented palace timeline later showed the title review began the following morning. Anne told William one more thing during their private conversation weeks later. After that briefing, she had written Charles a personal letter explaining why she challenged him. The king never replied, and hidden in its final page was a warning he had never truly answered. The ceremony ended without visible chaos. But behind palace doors, Charles had remembered every word, and soon Anne would be forced to defend them directly to his face. Anne did not arrive to beg for her title back. That was the first thing Charles misunderstood. When brother and sister finally entered the same private room after the order, there were no advisors between them and no ceremonial smiles to protect either one. The king stood beside his desk. His sister refused the chair offered to her. Then she placed a copy of the removal order between them and said 7 words that stripped away every layer of royal formality. "Look at me and say you meant it." Charles had agreed to the meeting only after William pressed him to act before the family conflict became impossible to contain. The prince had warned his father that silence was no longer protecting authority. The removal order, the formal instruction that changed how Anne would be identified in royal records, had already caused damage. Yet the king entered believing he had to defend sovereign authority, the monarch's power to make final decisions for the institution. His sister entered wanting one answer: conviction or wounded pride. Anne asked why decades of service had been answered with paperwork instead of a conversation. She reminded Charles that she had stood beside him through grief, uncertainty, and family fracture. The king stiffened. He accused her of repeatedly challenging his judgment and said the Windsor briefing had crossed a line. Her words, he insisted, had weakened him before senior members of his own household. She stared at him, almost stunned. "I warned you," she said. "I did not betray you." Anne pushed the document across the desk. Charles placed his palm over it, but he did not speak. She waited. Then her voice hardened. "Say it." The king looked at his sister. Still nothing. "Say it," she repeated. Finally the monarch answered, "I meant the order." Anne reached into her folder and produced the private letter she had sent after the ceremony. She asked whether Charles had read the entire message. His silence changed everything. The king had stopped halfway through. He had never reached the final page. Anne told him the unread warning was documented in that letter. Someone inside the household, she had written, was deliberately turning her private objections into evidence of a coordinated challenge to his reign. Charles immediately demanded a name. His sister refused. Anne gave him one condition. William had to examine the title removal process from the first briefing note to the final signature. The king resisted, but she did not move. For the first time, his anger faced something more dangerous than defiance. It faced doubt. Anne had finally forced Charles to confront the possibility that his anger had been guided. But discovering who shaped the decision meant following the paper trail behind the throne. Royal power rarely announces itself with raised voices. Sometimes it arrives as a paragraph added to a briefing note. A date moved forward. A phrase sharpened before a document reaches the sovereign. William understood that when he began tracing the process that ended with Anne's title being removed. The future king expected to find his father's anger. He did. What disturbed him was something else. Between the Windsor confrontation and Charles's signature, the description of Anne's actions had changed 3 times, and each version sounded more dangerous. William studied the administrative chronology, the official timeline showing how palace decisions moved from early notes to final approval. The first record described Anne's conduct as a family disagreement concerning ceremonial precedence. Ceremonial precedence simply meant the formal order in which senior royals were placed during official duties. It was serious, but it was personal. Then the language shifted. A later version called her actions resistance to sovereign direction. The final note used the phrase, breakdown of confidence. William felt trapped between loyalty and truth. The prince wanted to protect Charles's authority because any public sign of weakness around the monarch could damage the stability of the crown. But Anne had been judged through words that grew harsher each time the file changed. A private argument had been transformed into something resembling an institutional threat. Charles learned what his son was examining and reacted with immediate frustration. The king asked whether William now believed him incapable of making a decision without being manipulated. The future king chose his answer carefully. He did not question his father's right to decide. He questioned what information had reached him before he decided. William placed 3 copies of the briefing, side by side, during a private conversation with Charles. He asked the monarch to read the changing sentences aloud. The king read the first, then the second. When he reached breakdown of confidence, he stopped. Charles admitted he had never seen the original wording. He believed the final phrase reflected a formal household assessment, a structured judgment prepared by senior royal staff, rather than an altered summary of one family confrontation. The admission shook him because his signature had relied on that understanding. William found something worse. The accelerated title process had been advanced before Charles personally ordered officials to prepare the final removal document. Someone had anticipated the king's anger and moved the machinery forward. Anne received the findings directly from William during a private conversation. The prince told her the process had been shaped before the signature. But the order remained active. Only Charles could reverse or redefine it. The truth had weakened the foundation of Charles's decision, but it had not erased the king's signature, and Anne was about to discover what losing her title meant in practice. The real cruelty of a royal decision does not always appear when the order is signed. Sometimes it arrives the next morning, printed neatly on a page. Anne discovered that when a revised engagement document was placed before her, and the familiar words were gone. No dramatic announcement. No confrontation. Just her name, altered according to instruction. She stared at the line longer than anyone in the room expected. Then she picked up her pen, signed the schedule, and asked what time the car would leave. Anne watched the order spread through her daily work. Palace departments changed ceremonial schedules, internal correspondence, and future official documents. An engagement document was the formal paperwork listing a royal's public duties, timings, and official identity for an event. That mattered because the wording followed Anne wherever she served. Staff had been told to use the revised form without discussing the family dispute. Longtime aides now had to enforce a decision many knew had wounded her personally. Anne felt humiliation rise for one brief moment. She did not believe duty depended on a title. She had worked too long and endured too much to think service vanished with 2 missing words. But the erasure felt like an attempt to rewrite her history overnight. Years of appearances, funerals, crises, and exhausting schedules suddenly seemed reduced to a correction ordered by her own brother. A longtime aide finally spoke. He explained quietly that he had been required to approve the new format. Anne looked at him and immediately said he had done nothing wrong. She would not punish staff for Charles's decision. The aide left. Only then did her expression collapse. Anne opened a drawer and found an older program carrying the title she had worn for decades. She ran her thumb across the printed words. For several seconds, she simply held the page. Then she closed the drawer firmly, collected her schedule, and left for the engagement exactly on time. William contacted Anne later through a private conversation and told her what his review had uncovered. The prince explained that the language describing the Windsor confrontation had grown harsher before reaching Charles. Her fear had been correct. Someone had made one argument sound like a wider challenge to the reign. Anne refused William's suggestion that she defend herself publicly. She would not turn the crown into a family courtroom. Yet she admitted something far more painful. She no longer knew whether Charles trusted her at all. That night, a handwritten request arrived from the king. No advisors, no staff, no official record, just Charles asking Anne to meet him alone. For the first time since the title disappeared, Charles was no longer asking Anne to answer a royal order. He was asking his sister to meet her brother. There was no red box on the table, no private secretary waiting outside with a briefing, no William to translate one generation's anger to another. Charles had asked for Anne alone, and when she entered, her brother did something she had not expected. He did not defend the order. He did not demand an apology. He simply placed her letter on the table, the complete letter this time, and admitted he had finally read the last page. Anne remained silent. After days of fury, the truth had reduced the king to one sentence. "I should have finished it." Charles had arranged the meeting after rereading Anne's letter and reviewing William's evidence about the changing language inside the title removal briefings. A corrective order, meaning a new formal instruction used to reverse or repair an earlier royal decision, had not yet been issued. Until that happened, nothing said in the room carried official force. For once, brother and sister could speak without pretending every sentence belonged to the crown. Charles admitted the Windsor confrontation had wounded his pride. The king told Anne that her words came at a moment when he already felt pressure to prove complete control over his reign. Hearing his judgment challenged before senior household figures had made him feel exposed. He had treated that feeling like evidence. Now the monarch understood the difference. Anne did not soften her answer. She told Charles losing the title had hurt, but believing her brother accepted the worst version of her motives had hurt more. He had known her for a lifetime, yet the king had trusted sharpened briefing language before asking his sister whether she meant to undermine him. Charles reached for the removal order. He folded it once and placed it beneath Anne's letter. She watched him carefully. "You cannot fix this by pretending you never signed it," she said. Charles agreed. The king would not quietly restore the old wording and hide the mistake. He decided the monarchy had to acknowledge that the decision had been reached through a distorted process. A new declaration, a written royal statement carrying formal authority, would correct the order and explain why the change was necessary. Anne immediately refused to be portrayed as a victim. She demanded that Charles accept personal responsibility for signing before speaking to her. The monarch remained silent for several long seconds. Then he agreed. No excuse. No blame shifted entirely onto staff. His signature had been his decision. By sunrise, palace officials were preparing the new declaration. But before Charles could control its release, news of Anne's original title removal escaped into public view. Charles and Anne had finally spoken honestly in private, but outside those walls, the country was about to judge a decision it had only just discovered. By morning, the royal family's private fracture belonged to everyone. The story did not emerge as a vague rumor buried beneath ceremony. It arrived with 4 devastating words dominating a national front page: Anne's title removed by King. For decades, the public had associated the Princess Royal with relentless duty and blunt loyalty. Now broadcasters were asking why Charles had erased that title from official documentation. But one image outside Buckingham Palace captured the mood more powerfully than any debate on television. Charles watched the coverage in silence. The original order was now public, forcing the palace to confirm that the king had directed Anne's title to be removed from official royal documents. Those records were the formal papers through which the monarchy identified senior family members during duties and institutional work. The issue mattered because the country no longer saw a simple paperwork change. It saw a brother using royal authority against a sister known for decades of service. Charles heard the language grow harsher with every broadcast. Commentators did not describe him as strong. They questioned whether wounded pride had become royal policy. The king understood the damage immediately. What he had believed was a controlled internal decision was now being judged as punishment for a private argument. Anne, meanwhile, refused to disappear. Anne prepared for her scheduled engagement while an aide quietly suggested canceling. She rejected the idea at once. The princess told him that disappearing would make the title seem more important than the duty itself. Her decision carried weight because the public was watching for anger, retreat, or humiliation. Instead, she kept the commitment. Outside Buckingham Palace, a small crowd gathered beneath the gates. One elderly woman held a handwritten card reading, "Duty cannot be deleted." The photograph spread rapidly and became the defining public image of the day. It turned Anne's private pain into a simple national verdict. Paperwork could change, but memory could not. William contacted Charles directly after a major broadcaster framed the crisis around the king's judgment. The prince reminded his father that a corrective declaration, a formal written order designed to repair the effect of an earlier decision, had already been drafted, but he warned the monarch not to hide behind administrative language. Charles listened. Then the king made his choice. His statement would admit that he had acted before hearing Anne's full position. Hours later, he approved the final declaration restoring her title in official documentation. Yet Charles understood the signature alone would not settle the wound. The country now wanted something harder than correction. It wanted responsibility. The title could be restored with another signature, but Charles knew the final verdict would depend on whether he was brave enough to admit why it had ever been removed. The second order did not erase the first. Charles understood that before he signed it. Anne understood it too. The Princess Royal title would return to official royal documents, restoring the wording that had defined her public service for decades. But no one inside the family could pretend the previous days had been meaningless. A king's anger had become policy. A sister's loyalty had been mistaken for defiance. And the monarchy had been forced to confront a painful truth. Silence may protect appearances, but it can also turn private wounds into public mistakes. Charles signed the corrective declaration and ended the administrative effect of his earlier order. The declaration was a formal royal instruction used to correct an official decision and restore the wording attached to Anne in palace records. The king also approved a statement admitting that he had acted before fully considering his sister's written explanation. It acknowledged that internal language had made their disagreement sound far more dangerous than it truly was. Charles personally carried a copy of the corrected order to Anne. The king placed it before her and waited. She read every line slowly. No smile came. No relief broke through. Anne finally looked at her brother and said, "Restoring the words is easier than restoring trust." Charles accepted the rebuke. He did not defend the signature or blame palace staff. The monarch simply listened, as Anne admitted what had hurt most. Losing the title had been painful, but believing her own brother no longer understood the loyalty behind her bluntness had cut deeper. She had challenged him because she believed silence would fail him. He had mistaken that challenge for betrayal. Charles extended his hand across the table. Anne did not take it immediately. Several silent seconds passed before she placed her hand over his. "Next time, speak to me first," she said. The king agreed. Charles then approved a new family consultation rule, a private process requiring direct discussion with living senior royals before personal disputes could trigger major changes to their formal royal designation or institutional representation. The monarch had kept his authority, but he had finally understood that authority without listening could become isolation. Anne returned to duty under the restored title. She was not triumphant. She was not defeated. The Princess Royal simply continued serving, proving that her commitment had never been created by words on official paper. The crisis was finally closed. Charles learned that loyalty sometimes speaks with uncomfortable honesty. Anne learned that even a restored title cannot erase a wound. Only truth can begin to heal it. The documents were corrected. The title returned. Brother and sister remembered what happened. But pride no longer controlled the ending. And in the end, the crown survived, not because everyone remained silent, but because Charles and Anne finally chose honesty before pride turned one royal order into an irreversible family tragedy. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.